IBESS, Atmospheric Systems and Pollution Management Part 4, will focus on the framework of pollution management strategies. This is a very important movie, and the strategies outlined here must be applied to every type of pollution process covered in Parts 5, 6, 7, and 8, as well as climate change, a later unit. The significant idea is pollution management strategies can be applied at different levels. Here is the outline of all the available movies in the unit called Atmospheric Systems and Pollution Management. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. The impact of a society on the environment is a function of population size, per capita consumption, otherwise known as affluence, and technology that degrades the environment. Now, strategies to reduce pollution or mitigate the effects of pollution would be to simply consume less or to find technologies that do not degrade the environment but instead help mitigate pollution, such as filters or geoengineering projects. As we step toward looking at approaches to pollution management, the very first step would be to never release the pollutant at all. The word reduce embodies this first management strategy. Here are the relevant IB syllabus statements. Outline approaches to pollution management. Evaluate the effectiveness of each of 3 different levels of intervention. In the process of polluting the environment, the first step is the production of the pollutant. The first pollution management strategy would be to alter human activity by promoting the development of alternative technologies or the adoption of alternative lifestyles and values. And this can be done through the use of campaigns, through education, government legislation, economic incentives, or disincentives. This first level of intervention is the best for the environment because it simply reduces production of the pollution, and it's the least expensive strategy for societies to intervene at this level. Now, in the process of polluting the environment, the second step that happens is the release of the pollutant to the environment. Now, the second pollution management strategy would be to control the release of the pollutant by legislating and regulating standards of emissions, and developing technologies for extracting the pollutant from waste emissions. The technology that we have could be very useful, for example, in filtering or extracting the pollutant from the emissions. In polluting the environment, the third step is to experience the impact of the pollutant in the environment. Now, ideally, we would avoid this altogether, but the third pollution management strategy would be to clean up and restore damaged ecosystems by extracting and removing the pollutant from the ecosystem or replanting, restocking lost populations of plants and animals. Now, actions taken as a part of this third strategy are the least effective because the environment has already been degraded. As well, actions taken at this level are most expensive. Here is IB syllabus worth reading. Pollutants are produced through human activities and create long-term effects when released into ecosystems. Strategies for reducing these impacts can be directed at 3 different levels in the process: altering the human activity, controlling the release of the pollutant, and cleaning up the pollutant and restoring damaged ecosystems after the pollution has occurred. Students should be able to show the value and limitations of each of the 3 different levels of intervention. In addition, students should appreciate the advantages of employing the earlier strategies over the later ones and the importance of collaboration in the effective management of pollution. Before closely examining the 3 strategies, let's define them. Strategy 1 is altering human activity. Strategy 2 is controlling the release of the pollutant at the point of emission. And strategy 3 is cleanup and restoration of damaged ecosystems. Now, I want you to use the description of each strategy rather than simply referring to them as strategy 1 or 2, as I might do for time efficiency. From here to the end of this movie, I will provide examples of the 3 strategies using various pollution types. The focus here is not on one pollution type or the other, but rather examples of the strategies in action. In later movies, I will employ this framework specifically around each of the major pollution issues: stratospheric ozone depletion, smog, acid deposition, domestic waste, and climate change. Strategy 1 of pollution management is the altering of human activity through education, campaigns, legislation, economic incentives, or penalties. This strategy is the most cost-effective and prevents any degradation of the environment. Reduce is the term that best describes this strategy. Now, recycling and reuse are part of the second strategy because these serve to extract the pollutant from waste emissions. But when people recycle or reuse, less of the pollutant is manufactured in the first place. Thus, recycling and reuse are strategies that feed back to become incorporated into the first strategy. Keep this in mind. In terms of Strategy 1 action, which is altering the human activity through education, campaigns, legislation, economic incentives, and penalties, examples of behavior change would include switching off the lights or using fluorescent bulbs instead of incandescent bulbs. In terms of Strategy 1 action, which is altering human activity through education, campaigns, legislation, economic incentives, and penalties, examples of behavior change would include carpooling, riding a bicycle to work, or using public transportation. In terms of Strategy 1 action, which is altering human activity through education, campaigns, legislation, economic incentives, or penalties, examples of changing human activities would be to use alternative energy sources rather than fossil fuels as sources of energy. Recycling is a combination of the first and second strategies. Recycling controls the release of the pollutant to the environment at the point of emission, this is Strategy 2, by setting and imposing standards or introducing technologies for extracting the pollutant from waste emissions. Now, recycling extracts the pollutant from the emission stream, that's Strategy 2, but then reduces the need for a product whose manufacture causes more pollution. This is Strategy 1. Many substances other than aluminum cans can be recycled: plastic, rubber, and more. So let's evaluate Strategy 1. Strategy 1 is altering or reducing the human activity that ultimately causes the pollutant to be released. It is absolutely the best strategy with the least release of pollutants to the environment and the least costs due to the pollutants. However, it cannot always be employed. For example, if copper is necessary for technological products, copper must be mined. People are often unwilling to change their lifestyle. Alternative technologies may not yet exist, or if they do, they're likely to be costly. And lastly, recycling and reusing materials often requires coordinated action on the part of individuals, government, and industry. Now let's look at Strategy 2, ways of controlling the release of the pollutant into the environment by setting and imposing standards and developing technologies for extracting the pollutant from waste emissions. Smokestack scrubbers, catalytic converters in automobiles, and filters would serve the role of reducing pollution by extracting the pollution at the point of emissions. Now, government law can play a role here. By way of example, catalytic converters are mandatory in automobiles sold in most of the United States. Catalytic converters reduce the amount of carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides released in the exhaust of cars. Governments can provide monetary incentives or penalties for lack of compliance. Governments can enforce laws if they choose to. Wastewater treatment is an example of Strategy 2 in that the sewage water is cleaned before the water is released to the environment. Landfills, for the purposes of providing a location for industrial and domestic trash to be permanently located, directs the waste stream at the point of emissions to reduce waste being released into the environment. The pollutant goes from manufacturer to household to landfill without a widespread distribution into the natural environment. Recycling and reusing are both strategies that serve to manage the waste stream, strategy 2, by withdrawing the pollutant before it enters the environment. So let's evaluate the second strategy, which is controlling the release of the pollutant at the point of emission. First, it's a better strategy than cleaning up the environment after the pollutant's been released. But it's not as good a strategy as the first strategy because some environmental degradation will occur. As well, with strategy 2, it does require specialized technology for the extraction of the pollutant from the waste stream, and we may not yet have the technology necessary to do this. As well, it requires coordinated government industry action to bring it into effect, including fines and enforcement. And regulations and standards are political compromises, not always best for both worlds, the business world and the consumer public health world. Now let's look at strategy 3, which is the cleanup and restoration of damaged ecosystems by extracting and removing the pollutant from the ecosystem and then replanting and restocking with plant and animal populations. The long-term impact of pollutants on the environment can be reduced by cleaning up the environment. This is expensive, and the environment has already been degraded. Governments and non-governmental organizations can play a big role in assisting the cleanup of polluted environments by providing monies, incentives, and penalties. You can see in this image the great effort required to clean pollutants from the environment once they've been released. It's expensive and not fully effective in removing the pollutant. Governments can provide monies to make the cleanup possible. Cleaning up the environment after it's been polluted does not immediately restore the environment. The environment might already be degraded, and restoration might be an additional costly step in returning the environment to its more natural form. Removing the invasive species after the invasive species has arrived is expensive, and the environment has already suffered damage. Restoration and replanting, as you see here, is a costly step in returning the environment to its more natural, less degraded form. So let's evaluate the third strategy, which is cleaning up the pollutant and restoring ecosystems after the pollution has recurred. First, habitats can be restored. Pollutants can be removed, and this is good for the environment. However, this strategy is not as good as either strategy 1 or 2. As pollutants are released to the environment, there is environmental damage, and it's costly to clean up the pollutants. As well, the extraction of the pollutant from the environment may require technology that's not fully developed, and the technology may not even exist, and it's likely to be costly. As well, strategy 3 does require a coordinated effort by industry, environmentalists, scientists who know the ecosystem, and government. Here is an important IB syllabus statement that we will examine before bringing this movie to a close. Discuss the human factors that affect the approaches to pollution management. Cultural values, technological, economic, and political systems will influence the choice of pollution management strategies and their effective implementation. Real examples should be considered. Examples of cultural factors that affect approaches to pollution management include the idea that some cultures adopt throwaway attitudes. Some societies choose to recycle, they choose to educate, choose awareness campaigns. Some societies choose to limit pesticides or herbicides into the environment. And some societies have lifestyle choices that impact pollution management. That includes people choosing to eat organic foods, choosing to turn off the lights, choosing to recycle. Are you a part of a throwaway culture? Do you choose to recycle despite the effort? Does your government make recycling easier? Do you choose organic food? Historically, some throwaway cultures had little environmental impact because their waste was organic and biodegradable. But with the introduction of new technology, possibly cheaper alternatives such as plastics and styrofoams, the environmental consequences of throwaway cultures are significant. One's consumption can be a cultural factor that influences pollution management. Remember that one's ecological footprint includes land area to account for waste, specifically carbon dioxide emissions from the use of fossil fuel. Technological factors also influence pollution management strategies. For example, the availability of technology to produce renewable energy. Technological factors also influence pollution management strategies. For example, waste sorting technology to provide for successful recycling, or technology that allows for the design of environmentally successful landfills. Economic factors influence strategies for pollution management. For example, is it cheaper to pollute than to recycle? In other words, is there a cost in recycling or in buying filters? Is there a market for the pollutant, as you can see here in this image? It would be a market that leads to successful reuse and/or recycling. Economic factors influence strategies for pollution management. For example, are jobs more important than pollution protection? Or is the access to certain products, such as cotton, more important than the pollution, herbicide, or pesticide? Economic factors influence strategies for pollution management. For example, the cheap cost of fuel could be more important to societies than the costs associated with the pollution. Or are alternatives to fossil fuels costly, or do they require specialized technology, such as this wave energy technology seen in the image on the right? Or are there other issues with alternative energy projects? Continuing with examples of economic factors that influence strategies for pollution management, it's possible that the costs of limiting the pollutant would be very large and impractically large. It's possible that the cost of having a 100% clean environment would be too high to fully clean the environment. What's interesting and important for you to understand is that as pollution cleanup efforts reduce the pollution in the environment, the costs of cleanup go up and up and up. You should realize that societies will not pay huge quantities of money to make the environment perfectly 100% clean. So, what level of pollution are societies willing to tolerate? Think carefully here. How clean do you want the environment? How much money are you willing to pay to have it that clean? How much pollution will you tolerate in order to keep your money in your wallet? Political factors influence strategies for pollution management. For example, political solutions are difficult to implement, agreements require compromise, laws require enforcement, and generally political action is slow. Political factors influence strategies for pollution management. For example, the Clean Air Act of 1963. Or the most successful international agreement on the environment ever accomplished, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, that limited the release of CFCs. CFCs deplete the stratospheric ozone layer. And lastly, among political factors that influence strategies for pollution management, the Environmental Protection Agency can set standards on carbon dioxide emissions, but must be aware of the economic consequences. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS, Atmospheric Systems and Pollution Management, Part 4.